Today's horror story is written by PeaceSim. When he was little, Robert once asked me what the scarecrows that decorated our family's farm did before. I'd responded, "Before what?" And he specified that he meant before becoming scarecrows. I thought about toying with him and telling him some sinister origin story, like that they were people punished for misbehaving or monsters who once prowled the fields. But I knew that he, 5 years my junior, looked up to me for guidance, so I'd given him a literal answer. There wasn't any before. We made them as scarecrows, and that's all there was to it. I wasn't always so literal with him. Sometimes, at night, back when we shared a room, he'd shake me awake after having a nightmare. I'd tell him about how our scarecrows would keep him safe. How, if anything went wrong, they'd come in from the fields outside to protect us. We'd spent our childhoods running through those fields. We darted between rows of corn stalks and hid behind the tombstones of our small family graveyard. When our mother was still around, she'd scold us over the dirt we tracked into the house and the tears in our pants. She'd tell us to stop going out there for so long, that we'd get lost and not find our way back. But I always felt safe under the watchful eye of the sentinels who'd been there for as long as I can remember. Everything changed when our mother unexpectedly passed away. I'd seen the glare our stepdad Nick made towards Robert as we stood solemnly around the newest addition to the family cemetery. The biggest mistake Mom ever made was falling in love with Nick. As he charmed his way into her life, I sensed a cruelty behind the superficial kindness he showed towards me and Robert. When Mom wasn't around, he treated us spitefully. Now, we were stuck with him as our only parent. That evening, Nick screamed at Robert for hours. As Nick saw it, our mother wouldn't have been driving that night if Robert hadn't needed picking up from practice, and he wouldn't listen to any of my pleas that his reasoning didn't make any sense. Nick hadn't permitted Robert to have dinner, so that night, I discreetly brought a plate of food up to Robert's room. When I found him, he pressed his red face against the glass window. I knew what he was looking at and why his expression was of disappointment. Of course, we'd both outgrown the myths we'd once believed. Yet, in the moment, we shared a sense that the silhouettes in the distant fading red light had somehow let us down. Nick began erratically lashing out at Robert, no matter how many times I told him to stop blaming Robert for our mother's death. Usually, these episodes followed bouts of heavy drinking. When I smelled alcohol in Nick's breath, I'd encourage Robert to make plans elsewhere for the evening. I returned from theater practice once to find Robert nursing a bruise beneath his lip. When I asked him if Nick did it, his misty-eyed expression told me all I needed to know. When I confronted Nick, he told me that if I cared so much about Robert, I'd teach him to treat him with the respect he deserved. Our farm fell into disrepair as Nick stopped putting in the work necessary to maintain it. Our once thriving crops withered and died. Our scarecrows remained in place, but the lush land over which they'd once presided deteriorated into messy overgrowth. After Nick drunkenly crashed his car into the fence outside our house, I took it upon myself to drive Robert wherever he needed to go. Nick never fixed the fence. Our attention turned steadily away from the farmland where Robert and I had spent our youths towards our futures. In my senior year of high school, I set my eyes on a scholarship to a distant college. Any place far away and with a theater program, as a ticket out of our desolate small town and the wasteland of our estate. I also studied hard and encouraged Robert to do the same. When I saw the cast list for my theater class's Halloween production, my thoughts returned for the first time in years to the scarecrows on our farm. The costume they gave me bore an uncanny resemblance to the figures I'd grown up seeing as guardians. though the blue plaid shirt I would wear under a straw neck piece struck me as too neat, too clean. I took the shirt home that night and rubbed it against the dirt until a layer of dusty brown covered it. Donning it and the rest of the costume, I faced one of the scarecrows on our estate. It was imposing, despite its goofy straw hat, due to the scythe mounted against its shoulder and the sharp, jagged sticks that extended from its arms. "Well, am I convincing?" I asked, half-mockingly. The plain sack that was its face gazed back blankly. I shrugged, unsure of what response I'd been expecting. At practice the next day, a few students complimented my costume, which I'd also refined with several tufts of straw that obscured my hands and extended from my boots to over the hem of my pants. I paid little attention. Mostly I was focused on how two of my classmates, a well-built pair who recently been cut for the baseball team for disciplinary issues, who were taunting a frail sophomore who was having trouble with his dialogue. I told them to leave him alone. They scowled at me, but relented when our teacher took notice. I was heading to my car after school that day when I spotted them dragging the sophomore behind the building. Still in my costume, I charged over to intervene. The sophomore escaped, but I ended up taking the brunt of the beating they had intended for him. My classmates left me curled up in a ball, with my face and insides aching. But when I got up, there were no blood stains on the concrete surface. Just a dozen strands of straw that blew away in the mid-October breeze. I awoke in my bed the next morning feeling strangely itchy all over my body. To my bewilderment, I looked down to see that I was still wearing the costume from the play. As I changed clothes, I struggled to make sense of what had happened. I distinctly remembered removing the costume the night before. And it's not like I would have gone to sleep wearing the strong hat like I'd woken up with. "You didn't put a different set of clothes on me when I was asleep last night, right?" I asked Robert over breakfast. Before he could respond, my eye caught a wooden object flying through the air. "Down!" I called, prompting Robert to drop his head just in time to avoid the chair that crashed into the wall behind him. Nick staggered into the room. I'd never seen him drunk this early. He stammered incoherently about how Robert took his food, his money, and his wife from him. "Hey, Robert, why don't you go to the bus stop, okay?" I said as I positioned myself between him and Nick. Nick screamed that Robert wasn't going anywhere, but when he charged at Robert, I blocked him as Robert scrambled away. "If you ever do something like that again," I said, motioning to the fractured chair, "I'm calling the police. Do you understand me?" Nick lowered his face until it was level with mine and stared at me with bloodshot eyes. He finally broke. Between sobs, he told me that the night our mother died, he thought about using the gun he kept in his room on himself. We talked for hours as he finally opened up to me about how much he'd been struggling in our mother's absence. He told me he felt ashamed of how he'd treated me and Robert. He didn't scratch the surface of earning forgiveness, but I felt encouraged by his willingness to speak with me. Over the next week, he cut back his drinking. He apologized to Robert for first throwing the chair, then for an array of other horrible acts. As the premiere of my school's Halloween play approached, Nick told me that he was proud of me and couldn't wait to bring Robert to see it with him. "Okay, but please, Nick, promise me that you won't have anything to drink." He agreed. Snickers and awkward looks greeted me when I arrived at school the next day. I quickly realized what the issue was. "It's, for rehearsal," I mumbled as my classmates laughed at the costume I didn't remember putting on.
"That's some real method acting right there,"
said my friend Sally, who had the lead role as a friendly witch, with a wink.
"I like it."
Opening night went off without a hitch. Sally gave a virtuoso performance. I, meanwhile, captured the awkward movement and erratic cadence of her scarecrow sidekick, who'd once given up his humanity to bring a deceased loved one back to life. The audience cheered for us wildly as the curtains fell. Afterwards, my heart lifted when I found Robert and Nick smiling together as they congratulated me. Nick, for the first time in months, had shaved his face and neatly combed his hair. It had been years since he made himself presentable. He was getting better. The clear liquid in his plastic bottle had to be water, right? I offered to drive Robert home, but Nick insisted on doing it himself. I relented. I had to change out of my costume and help put away the props, after all. Sally would want me to help with that. Clearing the stage took about an hour. The cast and crew steadily departed until only Sally and I remained.
Need any help taking off your costume?
Asked Sally slyly. My heart raced. After all, I was alone with the crush. I'd always been too timid to ask out. Yeah, sure. She ran her hand across my back, searching without success for a way to unzip the prop shirt that held the outer layer of straw in place. I leaned my face towards hers. She smiled and planted my first kiss on my lips. For a moment, I felt elated, but her expression soured. She let go of me and stepped back. I asked her what was wrong.
You.
She muttered as she put her hand against her lips.
What are you?
What do you mean?
I'm sorry. I have to go.
She hurried away, leaving me downtrodden and confused. It was the late evening when I began the drive. As I did so, I watched parents take little kids by the hands up to front doors, decorated with pumpkins, skeletons, and spider webs. Mom had done that with us long ago. I miss that. A little boy and girl dressed as wizards gawked at me as I sat at a red light. I lowered the window and waved. The boy excitedly exclaimed that a scarecrow was driving a car. Night fell. In my headlights, an obstruction appeared a few dozen yards from my house. My heart sank as my eyes confirmed what I feared. Nick's car had crashed into an oak tree. I pulled over and hopped out, ignoring the heavy smoke. I sprinted up to the vehicle. "Robert!" I called. The driver's side door dangled open. The seat inside was empty. Across from it, the still form of my brother leaned against the contorted dashboard. Blood dripped from a deep bruise on his head. I dragged him out of the vehicle. I cried out. This was my fault. Nick hadn't changed, and I should never have let him drive Robert home. Finding unnatural strength, I carried Robert's limp form across the street and up the long driveway to our house. I spotted a figure at the edge of the decrepit field. It was the Scarecrow. The one I'd posed before when I was first working on my costume for the play. It stood still, yet it was far away from its normal location. Had someone moved it? "You were supposed to protect us," I said. "Why? What are you even doing here? What are you even looking after anymore?" I looked over the Scarecrow for several moments, trying to make sense of it. A heavy breeze shook it. It shifted and released its scythe, which tumbled to the ground. I leaned down, layers of straw protruding from my heels and my knees, and placed Robert's body on the dirt. Lifting the scythe with two hands, I turned and marched into the house. As I passed through the front hallway, I caught my reflection in a mirror. My face consisted of simply cloth. My mouth, nose, and eyes had receded to shallow stitches and drawings. I heard Nick's voice from his room. He was repeating things. Things like, "It's not my fault," and "It was only a few drinks." I pushed open the door. As I approached Nick, I dragged the curved blade across the floor. He made a panicked yell upon seeing the form before him. He removed his gun from the drawer and fired it. The bullets that passed through caused bits of straw to scatter across the floor. I lifted and swung. He screeched as the blade lodged between his neck and shoulder. I drew it across his chest, sending blood splattering against the wall. I swung again. He collapsed, gargling. His last expression was one of terror mixed with confusion. I had one thing left to do. Back outside, I approached Robert's body. My body grew increasingly stiff and non-responsive as I stumbled towards him. Finally, I lifted my dense straw arm and pressed against his wound. "He won't hurt you again," I whispered. My senses and strength gradually dissipated as Robert's wound partially healed. By the time Robert gasped a furtive breath, my own life had largely faded. With all I could muster, I trudged through the weeds until I arrived at our family cemetery. A thick, wooden post was already waiting for me near our parents' graves. As I positioned myself up high on the post, I looked over our farm and watched as my brother was rushed away amidst flashing blue and red. I worried about his future. I wanted to continue to be there for him. Maybe I could still help him. Someday. But I knew that my own journey was at an end. I wondered if it was like that for the others who stood in perpetual watch over our property. If they too had been reduced to artifice through harshness in life. With a strange contentment, I realized that I'd been wrong so long ago. There was a before, for me at least, a role I was meant to fulfill. But now, I had finally arrived where I sensed I'd always belonged. And special thanks to DodgeThis 82 for helping me out. Thank you for listening. You can probably handle another horror story, right?